The Kin people, also known as the Viet people or simply the Viets, are a Southeast Asian ethnic group native to present-day northern Vietnam and southern China. They speak Vietnamese, the most widely spoken language in the Austroasiatic family. According to the 2019 census, the Kin make up just over 85% of Vietnam's population. In official usage, the name Kin serves to distinguish them from other ethnic groups living within the country, such as the Hmong, Cham, and Muong. Within Vietnam, the Vietnamese are one of four main groups that speak Vietic languages. The other three are the Mun, Tho, and Chit. Among these groups, the Kin became dominant over time, both demographically and politically, largely occupying lowland river regions, while related groups remained in upland or peripheral areas. Although the Kin are often treated as a single, clearly defined people today, their identity developed gradually through long historical processes, rather than existing as a fixed group from the beginning. In this video, we explain who the Kin people are, their proposed origins, early references in Chinese records, debates about the homeland of Vietic languages, the period of Chinese rule, the medieval and early modern Vietnamese states, developments from the 16th century to the modern era, genetic studies of the Kin population, and the historical reasons why the surname Nguyen became dominant in Vietnam. The earliest references to the ancestors of the Vietnamese appear in Chinese historical records, where they are described as the Lac Viet, or Dom Sonian peoples. These groups formed an ancient tribal confederacy that occupied the Red River Delta in what is now northern Vietnam. They were likely not linguistically uniform, but instead consisted of communities speaking a mixture of Austroasiatic and Kra Dai languages. Archaeologically, they are associated with the Dom Son culture, known for bronze working and wet rice agriculture, which became a defining feature of lowland life in the region. One widely discussed hypothesis places the deeper origins of the Kin among Proto-Austroasiatic populations living in southern China, possibly in regions such as Yunnan, Lingnan, or along the Yangtze River, as well as parts of mainland Southeast Asia. From this broader Proto-Austroasiatic population, several branches emerged over time. Monic-speaking groups moved further west, Khmeric-speaking groups migrated south, and the Munda-speaking populations of northeastern India diverged even earlier, a separation reflected in the greater linguistic distance of their basic vocabulary. Most archaeologists, linguists, and related specialists agree that these Proto-Austroasiatic populations arrived in mainland Southeast Asia no later than 2000 BC, bringing with them river-based agriculture and especially the cultivation of wet rice. Another line of argument focuses on population movement within Vietnam itself. Some linguists have proposed that Vietic-speaking communities originally lived in the north-central region of Vietnam and later migrated northward into the Red River Delta, which may previously have been inhabited by Thai-speaking populations. However, this view is challenged by scholars who point out that Chinese sources from the Han and Tang periods show no clear records of major population shifts in Jiaoji, the administrative region centered on the Red River Delta. These sources instead suggest a relatively stable population of Austroasiatic speakers in the Delta, ancestral to modern Vietnamese, throughout much of this period. A different hypothesis, based on patterns of linguistic diversity, places the homeland of the Vietic languages further west. According to this view, the greatest diversity of Vietic languages appears in areas that are now Bolikamsai and Khmer provinces in Laos, as well as parts of Nghệ An and Quang Binh provinces in Vietnam. In the 1930s, clusters of Vietic-speaking communities discovered in the hills of eastern Laos were interpreted by some scholars as evidence that these regions may have been among the earliest centers of Vietic settlement. Despite these competing theories, many researchers continue to associate the emergence of the Vietic languages most closely with northern Vietnam, particularly the Red River Delta. This region later became the political and cultural core of what would eventually be recognized as Vietnamese civilization, even if the linguistic and ethnic situation there was complex and fluid in earlier periods. Some scholars argue that a distinct Vietnamese identity or language did not fully exist before or during the Han Tang period, During this time, communities in northern Vietnam and southern China lacked clear ethnic boundaries and cannot easily be described as Vietnamese or kin in a modern sense. Evidence suggests the existence of a Han Viet population that used both a Chinese dialect, often referred to as Annamese Middle Chinese, and Proto-Viet Muong. Even so, the inhabitants of the Red River Valley did not share a single unified identity or language. What later became Vietnamese cultural identity emerged gradually, shaped by sustained Chinese influence acting upon local traditions, and only became clearly recognizable after the end of direct Chinese rule, particularly during the Song dynasty. For this reason, attempts to assign modern ethnic labels to ancient populations in the region are often problematic and unreliable. The Kinh Vietnamese trace their ancestry to both Dong Son-related populations and groups from southern China, including those related to the Nguyen. Genetic and craniometric studies suggest that Dong Son-associated peoples were not directly continuous with earlier Hoa Binh hunter-gatherers of northern Vietnam. Instead, they show evidence of substantial admixture with East Asian populations. Other research, however, points to partial affinities between present-day Kinh Vietnamese and hunter-gatherers from the Con Công Gua site in Thanh Hoa, dating to around 6.2 thousand calibrated years before present. These individuals were phenotypically closer to late Pleistocene Southeast Asians and to modern Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations. The Dong Son culture was developed by the Lac Viet peoples, who are also credited with founding the Vun Lang chiefdom. This early polity was traditionally ruled by the semi-mythical Hun kings. South of the Lac Viet and the Dong Son cultural zone lay the Sa Huyn culture, associated with Austronesian-speaking Chamic peoples. Between roughly 400 and 200 BC, the Lac Viet came into contact with the Oviet, a group connected to Tai-speaking populations from southern China, as well as with Sinitic peoples from further north. According to later Chinese chronicles, Tuc Phan, the leader of the Oviet, conquered Vun Lang and deposed the last Hun king sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century BC. After securing the submission of local Lac leaders, Thuc Phan declared himself King Ndung and established the Kingdom of O-Lac, uniting the Lac Viet and Oviet under a single political structure. In 179 BC, Zhao Tuo, a Chinese general who had founded the state of Nanyue in what is now southern China, annexed O-Lac. This event marked the beginning of sustained Sino-Vietic interaction that would last for nearly 1,000 years. In 111 BC, the Han Empire conquered Nanyue, bringing northern Vietnam directly under Han administration and integrating it into the Chinese imperial system. From the 7th to the 9th centuries AD, during the period of Tang rule, historians suggest that Vietnamese-speaking populations became increasingly distinct from other Vietic-speaking groups, such as the Mun and Chit. This divergence is generally attributed to stronger and more sustained Chinese cultural and administrative influence in the lowland areas inhabited by the ancestors of the kin. In the mid-9th century, local uprisings supported by the Nanzhao Kingdom nearly ended Tang control in the region. Although the Tang dynasty eventually reasserted authority in 866, the aftermath forced many rebels to flee into mountainous areas. This movement is often seen as a key moment in the long-term separation between the Vietnamese of the lowlands and related upland groups such as the Muong. During the first 6 centuries of Chinese rule, local Chinese populations in the region underwent a greater degree of Vietnamization than local Vietnamese did of Sinicization. Demographic patterns remained relatively stable during this early period. In contrast, Chinese migration during the Tang era was large enough to produce noticeable social changes in parts of northern Vietnam. Many Chinese migrants arrived as soldiers or merchants, married local women, and settled permanently. These settlers typically formed nuclear families, contributing to a decrease in average household size. Even so, Chinese migration into Vietnam remained limited compared to migration into Guangdong or Guangxi, in part because Vietnamese social structures restricted the ability of Chinese authorities to fully register and tax the local population. Despite these influences, Vietnamese society retained its language and many core cultural practices. Other groups, including the Nguyen, Tay, and Nung, avoided direct Chinese control by moving into upland regions beyond the reach of imperial administration. Migration from non-Chinese foreign groups also occurred in the south, driven by pressures such as the expansion of the Champa Kingdom. Genetic evidence indicates that around 10.5% of Kinh Vietnamese carry the Han Chinese OM7 haplogroup, pointing to significant assimilation of Chinese migrants in northern Vietnam. In 938, Nguyen, a local leader from Thanh Hoa, led Vietnamese forces to defeat a Chinese naval fleet at the Bac Dun River. Following this victory, he proclaimed himself king, establishing a polity that can be seen as the first independent Vietnamese state after centuries of Chinese domination. Nguyen died in 944, and the political order he had established quickly fragmented. Power broke down into a period of instability marked by conflicts among 12 warlords and local chiefs. This situation lasted until 968, when Dinh Bo Linh succeeded in defeating his rivals and reunifying the territory. He proclaimed the establishment of the Great Viet Kingdom, restoring centralized authority over the Red River Delta and its surrounding regions. With the support of influential Buddhist monks, Dinh Bo Linh selected Hoa Lu, located on the southern edge of the Red River Delta, as the capital rather than the former Tang administrative center of Dai La. He adopted imperial titles, coinage, and ceremonial practices modeled on Chinese precedents, while largely maintaining the existing administrative framework. In 979, Emperor Din Tin Huang was assassinated. In the aftermath, Queen Dung Vân Nga married the general Lê Hoan and appointed him emperor. Political instability during this transition attracted attention from neighboring powers, including the Song dynasty in China and the Kingdom of Champa, but both were successfully repelled by Lê Hoan. A Khmer inscription dated to 987 records the presence of Vietnamese merchants in Angkor, indicating early regional trade connections. Sources from Champa also record interactions with the Vietnamese. An early 11th century Cham inscription from Chien Dan at My Son, commissioned by King Haravarman IV, mentions Khmer and Viet captives being offered as slaves to local deities and temples at the citadel of Tralao Svan. At the same time, many Kinh Vietnamese lived within Champa and became well integrated into its society, much like other Austroasiatic-speaking groups residing there. From 968 to 1407, Dai Viet was ruled successively by the Ding, early Lê, Lý, Trần, and Ho dynasties. Many members of these ruling families had Chinese ancestry, yet the kingdom experienced long periods of relative stability. In 2010, Emperor Lý Thái Tô moved the capital from Hoa Lu to Dai La, located at the center of the Red River Delta. Elite marriage alliances among noble families helped consolidate political power. During this period, Mahayana Buddhism became the state religion, while Cham, Indian, and Chinese influences shaped Vietnamese musical instruments, dance traditions, and religious practices. Confucianism also began to gain increasing influence within the state. The Mongol-led Yuan dynasty attempted to invade Dai Viet in the mid-13th century, but failed in campaigns during the 1250s and 1280s, despite briefly sacking Hanoi. In 1406, the Ming dynasty of China successfully conquered Dai Viet, bringing it under Chinese rule for approximately 20 years. This occupation ended when the Vietnamese leader Lê Lợi expelled the Ming forces. The reign of Lê Lợi great-grandson, Emperor Lê Thanh Tông, from 1460 to 1497, is widely regarded as one of the high points in Vietnamese history. His rule was marked by sweeping administrative, military, educational, and fiscal reforms. He promoted a cultural transformation that replaced the old aristocracy with a new class of Confucian-trained scholar officials. Under his leadership, Confucianism became the dominant ideological foundation of the state, and Dai Viet evolved from a Southeast Asian-style polity into a centralized bureaucratic system. His armies, equipped with gunpowder weapons, defeated Champa decisively in 1471 and later launched unsuccessful campaigns against the Lao and Lan Na kingdoms in the 1480s. After the death of Lê Thanh Tông in 1497, the Dai Viet kingdom entered a period of decline. Environmental stress, including extreme climate conditions and repeated crop failures, combined with growing regionalism and factional conflict, weakened central authority. From the early 16th century through the late 18th century, political power in Vietnam was divided among four major families: the Mac, Le, Trient, and Nguyen. Each controlled its own territory and governed largely independently. In the northern realm, known as Dang Nguai, the lay emperors remained on the throne in name, while real authority rested with the Trient lords. The Mac family dominated the northeastern regions. In the south, the Nguyen lords ruled the territory known as Dang Trong. During this period, large numbers of ethnic Vietnamese migrated southward, settling former Cham lands. Over time, many Cham inhabitants were absorbed into the expanding Vietnamese state. Vietnamese settlers also moved into the Central Highlands, where they intermarried with local populations over several centuries. From the 16th century onward, European missionaries and traders began arriving in increasing numbers. They introduced new religions, ideas, and crops to Vietnamese society. By 1639, there were approximately 82,500 Catholic converts across Vietnam. In 1651, Alexandre de Rhodes published a catechism written in Latin and Romanized Vietnamese, known as Chu Quoc Nu, which later became the modern Vietnamese writing system. Internal conflict among Vietnamese factions ended in 1802, when Gia Long, aided by French mercenaries, defeated the Tay Son kingdoms and reunified the country. By 1847, under Emperor Thiệu Triet, the population identified as Người Vietnam accounted for nearly 80% of the state's population. This demographic pattern continued through the periods of French colonial rule, Japanese occupation, and into the modern era. Between 1862 and 1867, the southern third of Vietnam was transformed into the French colony of Cochinchina. By 1884, all of Vietnam had fallen under French control. The central and northern regions were reorganized into the protectorates of Annam and Tonkin, while Cochinchina remained a colony. In 1887, these three entities were formally unified within the structure of French Indochina. French rule introduced major political and cultural changes, including the establishment of a Western-style education system that brought new humanist values into Vietnamese society. Although the Vietnamese have a long recorded history, the modern ethnic identity of the Kinh only began to take clearer shape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, influenced in part by colonial administration. French policies of ethnic classification, along with the spread of nationalism, ethno-nationalist thinking, and social Darwinist ideas, shaped the discourse of the emerging Vietnamese intelligentsia. These developments contributed to rising ethnic tensions, which reached a peak during the late 1940s, at the outset of the First Indochina War. This period saw episodes of violence between Vietnamese and Khmer communities in the Mekong Delta. The mid-20th century marked a decisive turning point with the Vietnam War, which lasted from 1955 to 1975. The conflict brought profound social, economic, and political disruption, leaving lasting effects on Vietnamese society. After the war ended in 1975, Vietnam faced severe economic hardship and strained social conditions. In response, the state pursued reconstruction and reconciliation, eventually introducing economic reforms known as the Doi Mai policies in the late 20th century. Originally based in northern Vietnam and parts of southern China, the Vietnamese gradually expanded southward over many centuries. Through this process, they conquered and absorbed large areas that had previously belonged to the Champa Kingdom and parts of the Khmer Empire. As a result, the Vietnamese became the dominant ethnic group across most provinces of present-day Vietnam. Outside Vietnam, they form a small minority in neighboring Cambodia. A 2020 study shows that Kinh Vietnamese have historically concentrated in lowland areas, particularly fertile river plains suitable for wet rice agriculture. From around the 16th century onward, Vietnamese communities also began migrating beyond Vietnam's borders for commercial and political reasons. Some moved into Cambodia, while others settled in southern China. In China, the descendants of these migrants are officially recognized as the Jin ethnic group and mainly live in and around Guangxi province. In Cambodia, Vietnamese communities grew to become the country's largest ethnic minority, making up about 5% of the population at their peak. During the Khmer Rouge period, Vietnamese residents were subjected to severe persecution, and many survivors fled back to Vietnam. During the era of French colonial rule, Vietnam held a privileged position within French Indochina. French authorities viewed it as their most important Asian colony, and Vietnamese elites often enjoyed higher social status than other local populations in Laos and Cambodia. Educated Vietnamese were frequently trained and appointed positions within colonial administrations outside Vietnam, rather than local elites from those territories. At the same time, a notable number of Vietnamese students studied in France, mostly drawn from elite families. Vietnamese migration to France increased significantly during the First and Second World Wars, when France recruited soldiers and laborers from its colonies to support the war effort in Europe. The wave of migrants during World War I marked the first substantial Vietnamese presence in France and, more broadly, in the Western world. After Vietnam gained independence in 1954, additional migrants arrived in France, including individuals who had remained loyal to the colonial government. During the division of Vietnam into North and South, South Vietnamese students and merchants also traveled to France, which remained a key economic partner of South Vietnam. The fall of Saigon in 1975 and the end of the Vietnam War triggered a much larger global movement of people known as the Vietnamese diaspora. Millions fled the country, escaping the new communist regime. In response to what was widely recognized as an international humanitarian crisis, countries such as the United States, France, Australia, and Canada accepted large numbers of Vietnamese refugees. Genetic studies show that the Kinh Vietnamese share close affinities with Thai Kadai-speaking populations, particularly Thais and the Dai people. Like many Thai Kadai groups from mainland China, the Kinh display genetic characteristics associated with the ancient Baiyue populations. Evidence also suggests that the Kinh diverged from the Hlai, who possess the highest levels of Baiyue ancestry among Thai Kadai groups, earlier than the Dai diverged from the Hlai. Overall, the genetic makeup of the Kinh reflects a mixture of contributions. A major component comes from southern Han Chinese populations, alongside smaller inputs from Laotians, Malays, including Proto-Malay, Negrito, and Bidayu groups, and certain Thai populations such as the Mlabri and Hatin. Gene flow between the Kinh and the Khmer appears to have been largely one-directional, with stronger evidence for Kinh genetic contribution to the Khmer genome than the reverse. There is no genetic evidence indicating that the Cham contributed to the Kinh gene pool as a result of the southward expansion known as Nam Tien. However, earlier intermarriage between well-assimilated Kinh and Cham communities in the former Champa Kingdom did result in shared mitochondrial DNA haplotypes between present-day Kinh and Cham populations. On the maternal side, most Vietnamese belong to mitochondrial haplogroups M and N. Haplogroup M accounts for roughly 39% of the population, while haplogroup N accounts for about 61%. Common subgroups within haplogroup M include haplogroup D and M7, while haplogroup N is dominated by R9F and haplogroup B. Regional variation is evident. In northern Vietnam, haplogroups A, B4, F1A, and G are frequent. Haplogroups A and C are particularly common in the northwest, while M and M7 peak in the northeast and in areas near the Gulf of Tonkin. Haplogroup M71 is most prominent in central Vietnam. In contrast, haplogroups M and M7 are relatively rare in both the far northwest and the far south, including areas near the Mekong Delta. In southern Vietnam, haplogroup D appears at lower levels, while haplogroup N reaches its highest frequency. R9F is also present to a notable extent in the south, though it is most common in the Red River Delta, where it reaches roughly one-third of the population, followed by central and then northwest Vietnam. On the paternal side, the most common Y chromosome haplogroups among Vietnamese are O1A1A2, O1B1A1A, and N4 F2930. In Vietnam, Nguyen is by far the most common surname, carried by an estimated 30 to 40% of the population. On its own, the name indicates little beyond Vietnamese identity. For most people who bear it, tracing family history beyond a few generations is difficult, and the surname itself offers little genealogical distinction. This reflects the relatively limited role that family names have traditionally played in Vietnamese society. The use of surnames in Vietnam dates back to 111 BC, when the Han dynasty began its long period of rule over the region. Before this time, there is little evidence that the local population used family names in a systematic way, largely due to the absence of written records. Even the name Vietnam has Chinese origins, with Viet derived from the term used by Chinese sources to describe peoples living south of Yunnan. It is likely that, prior to Chinese domination, Vietnamese communities did not use hereditary surnames, a situation that was common in many parts of the world before the modern period. In much of the pre-modern world, people were more often identified through patronymic systems, in which a person's name referred directly to their parent, rather than to a fixed family lineage. Hereditary family names generally spread through conquest or administrative control by states that relied on them, including the Romans, the Normans, and in East and Southeast Asia, the Chinese. China had long maintained a developed system of surnames, often tied to taxation, social status, occupation, or regional origin. During Chinese rule in Vietnam, administrators needed a practical way to register, monitor, and tax the local population. Because many communities lacked family names, Chinese officials assigned surnames to people under their jurisdiction, drawing from a limited pool of Chinese names or their local adaptations. Nguyen is derived from the Chinese surname Ruan, which may itself originate from the name of an ancient Chinese state or from a lute-like musical instrument of the same name. In many cases, Chinese administrators used their own surnames to label the populations they governed. This practice was not unique to Vietnam and can be seen elsewhere in the colonial world, where conquered populations adopted or were assigned the names of ruling elites. Over time, the surname Nguyen became widespread as a result of these administrative practices. The popularity of Nguyen cannot be explained by early Chinese assignment alone. Although surnames appeared earlier in Vietnam than in many other regions, they never became central to personal identity. Vietnamese social interaction relied more heavily on given names combined with kinship terms that expressed age, status, and social relationship. As a result, surnames remained flexible and could be changed without much social consequence. This flexibility encouraged the adoption of the surname of the ruling family as a sign of loyalty. Throughout Vietnamese history, people frequently changed their surnames when political power shifted, avoiding association with fallen dynasties. The most significant increase in the use of Nguyen occurred during the Nguyen dynasty, which ruled Vietnam from 1802 to 1945. While the surname already existed before this period, its prevalence grew substantially under Nguyen rule. This pattern is not unique to Vietnam. A similar process occurred in Korea with the surname Park, originally associated with King Hyokjo's Park, the founder of one of the three kingdoms. Although the surname theoretically traced back to a single royal ancestor, many commoners adopted it later, particularly after social reforms in the late 19th century.